Thank you, Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Arneson, a miracle happens every day. We walk over to the light switch, and we turn it on, and lights come on. That's a pretty remarkable thing, and it's been a huge reason why this country has developed the way it has. So we all see huge consequences when we don't have access to power. We're talking a lot about high-tech threats and challenges. I would tell you that as a veteran of the utility industry, you should also worry about low-tech. My guys would tell you that a 22 in the right place could do almost as much damage as anything we're talking about today. And so with some knowledge, we know that a lot of our substations are not protected, they're not securitized. I would add that to the list of things that we ought to be thinking about as we look at protecting the grid.
If I can react to that, and again, in my opening statement, I remarked that we do have standards in place. Standards in and of themselves are not security. If you mandate a 10-foot fence around everything, the adversary brings a 12-foot ladder. So you want to make them bring that ladder, but you don't want to pretend that just because you have that, you are secure. Another component to security is this idea of resilience and redundancy.
Yep.
As you know, and I've mentioned a few times, and so has Mr. Koppel, 45,000 substations. These are by definition soft targets. They are in communities, they are in cities, they are in valleys, they are on mountains, they are in rural areas. So to try to protect everything from everything is a fool's errand. What we need to do is continue to build that capacity to be responsive and redundant when things happen. And I'll give you one quick example. You may be familiar with an attack that happened in Silicon Valley a couple of years back. One or more people, we still don't know, shot up a substation, rendering inoperable 17 of the 21 transformers there. It was a bad attack. But I will note that the lights didn't even blink in San Francisco or Palo Alto. So it shows the enormous resilience of this grid.
But a coordinated attack with somebody with a great deal of knowledge about how you create redundancy on the grid could create real problems in a classic or traditional attack.
We agree completely. And your point about low tech, it's Occam's razor, the simplest is the most likely. It's a lot easier for the hunter who had a bad day to go take pot shots than it is for a well-coordinated combined cyber-physical attack. There's sort of an adversarial curve. I want to quote John Brennan, the director of the CIA. Those who can do this damage don't want to, and those who want to can't. Now, I will say that axiom is not static. Yeah. There are certainly adversaries who are going to get more sophisticated.
And we can't afford the exception that proves the rule.
And we have to.
That's the point.
And we have to stay more sophisticated than they do. That's exactly right.
I'm concerned about what happens, Major Dunbar, in the event of a catastrophic power outage as it relates to first responders and the resiliency and redundancy for first responders to operate in a world where we don't have access to electricity. And I'm wondering what planning you've done in the state of Wisconsin or other organizations. In North Dakota, we have an emergency management plan that's reviewed periodically with the National Guard. It has proven to be an invaluable resource when we look at the major floods where we did experience power outages or huge snowstorms with ice that takes down power lines. What kind of systems should we be looking at for first responders so that we can, in fact, keep the peace in the event of a catastrophic outage?
Thank you, Senator. Wisconsin, like all states, we also have an emergency management plan that we update periodically. We've had experience with power outage, but not on the scale that we're talking about, long-term and widespread. It's one thing if a small part of the community has power outage and the fire department and the police department have systems that they have right now to allow them to go into these areas and have generators and things like that and operate. The scale we're talking about, we don't have plans.
Right.
We're trying to get our head around what that would look like, the very point that my colleagues at the panel are making in terms of how it's one thing to have power outage for a couple of hours. I joke with my wife, the power goes out for a couple of hours. It's almost romantic, right? You let a candle. It's not going to be romantic after a month. It's going to be a bad day, a bad week, a bad month in America. And then add to that if people start to leave their homes. A big concern of mine as a Homeland Security Advisor in the state. If this happens in Milwaukee, our largest city in Wisconsin or, God forbid, Chicago to our south, and people start to leave their homes.
I just think it's something that we need to have that communications network. We need to have the ability to continue to manage an emergency response network in the event of a catastrophic power outage. And you know, so prevention, hugely important, but also analyzing what we do with consequences. And Mr. Koppel, you mentioned food security. The World Food Program tests food all the time. They have packets that they deliver or drop from the sky. They're just now transitioning to a high-protein, high-calorie product. Have you looked at all at what the World Food Program does to basically look at logistics in very difficult places and what they do with food security?
No, ma'am, I have not. But I would point out to the senator, we're not talking about delivery. I think if there's one thing that the United States absolutely surpasses any other country in the world at, it is delivery. I'm talking about availability.
Yeah.
In a state like New York, for example, you have 17 million people in the state. They have, let's say, 20 or 30 million MREs stored in New York State.
Yeah.
Do the math.
Yeah.
You're talking about 2 days' worth of food.
You might be a little concerned about delivery if the power goes out and you can't pump the gas.
That's absolutely.
You know,
No,
I think you have to imagine, as Hollywood does all the time, what an event like this looks like and what's the key components. But
You're absolutely right, Senator. And the other point I would make, which I was discussing with General Dunbar before this session, is that we have a diminished number of military in uniform.
yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, if and when an event like this occurs, ultimately every state and the federal government is going to be dependent upon the Northern Command, NORTHCOM.
Yeah.
We don't have enough troops to do what would be necessary in this kind of an event. And if I may, one other, your colleague Senator Ayotte asked if there's anything we're leaving out. I don't want this to be left out. The question of attribution. Any other kind of attack that is launched against the United States, it's easy for our intelligence branches to discover instantaneously who did it, where the attack is coming from. In the event of a cyber attack, attribution becomes one of the biggest problems. You can't respond if you don't know who did it. And it might take months before we actually determine, with any sense of certainty that would permit the president to respond, who did it. That's a huge issue and one that needs to be examined more closely.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity for us to have this conversation, to think about preparation, because 90% of making this work is actually being prepared and being able to imagine the what-ifs. And the what-ifs aren't related always just to highfalutin security attacks. There's some amazing things that can happen just conventionally with some very determined and bad people. And so, General, thank you so much for your service. We need to continue to recruit into our National Guard. That's a challenge, I think, for all of the National Guard today. And talking about these issues publicly in terms of what importance it is for people to serve in uniform, especially in the National Guard. Mr. Koppel, your book is a perfect example and a great recruiting tool to tell people what, in fact, the value of that service is. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.